Good evening, my friends. It is September 4th, 2025, here in New York City, and the air outside carries the last breath of summer before autumn settles in. Tonight, let us step back through time into the heart of medieval castles, where kings and queens sought sleep not in fairy tale luxury, but in fragile warmth against the winter chill. Imagine the scene: a chamber deep within stone walls. The fire burns low, whispering with a scent of charred oak. Curtains of heavy velvet fall around the bed, their folds catching the glow of embers. A king lies beneath layers of fur, while a queen, beside him, or in her own guarded apartment, feels the sting of frost pressing against the walls. Outside, the wind rattles through arrow slits and howls across the battlements. But inside, silence prevails, broken only by the crackle of firewood and the soft breath of sleep. These royal rooms were not always so private. In earlier centuries, monarchs slept in vast halls among courtiers, guards, and petitioners. Fires blazed at the center, but warmth escaped into high, vaulted ceilings. Privacy was scarce, and comfort almost unknown. Yet, as centuries passed, kings and queens retreated into smaller, enclosed chambers. This shift reshaped not only how they slept, but how they ruled. Solitude allowed counsel in whispers. Decisions made away from the restless hum of the great hall. Still, the castle itself remained an unforgiving host. Thick stone walls absorbed dampness, floors chilled the feet, and water jugs froze overnight. To survive, royalty layered protection upon protection: goose feather mattresses, sable and ermine furs, tapestries stretched across walls to trap heat, carpets rolled over cold stone. Even then, warmth was never complete. A chamber might glow near the hearth, yet only steps away, frost gathered in corners. Behind this constant struggle lay the greater rhythm of climate. Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries endured what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Winters lengthened, rivers froze solid, and harvests often failed. Peasants huddled by smoky hearths in cottages, while monarchs marshaled their wealth to fashion warmth within fortresses of stone. The struggle was shared, though on different scales. Gold and furs could soften the night, but they could not drive away the breath of winter pressing through the castle walls. What survives in history is not only the splendor of crowns and courts, but the quiet battle with nature. Curtains drawn, close against drafts, the red glow of embers fighting against darkness. The creak of timbers as a storm raged outside. These details shaped royal life. As surely as coronations and wars dot in the chapters ahead, we will follow this story in its layers. We will begin with the silent, curtained chambers where monarchs found fragile refuge. We will uncover the materials: fire, fur, feathers that became their unseen armor. We will look back to the moment when kings abandoned the communal hall for private chambers, transforming life inside the castle. We will walk through the icy corridors of fortresses, built to defy enemies yet powerless against frost. And finally, we will meet the true adversary of all, the winter itself, deepened by the Little Ice Age, which spared no rank or crown. So settle in, my friends. Let the past draw near, slow and steady like the crackle of a fire on stone. Don't forget to subscribe to support this journey and follow along for the next chapters. The chamber waited with a hush that felt almost like snow. A thin red seam of ember glowed in the hearth and sent a soft breath of warmth toward the bed. Velvet curtains hung like a forest of still trees, heavy with the scent of smoke and war. The stone beyond them kept its own counsel. It held the night inside its bones. Every surface remembered frost. The bed rose high on sturdy legs of oak. The frame creaked from time to time as the weight of quilts shifted with the slow rhythm of sleep. A king rested beneath pelts that once crossed winter forests. A queen in the apartment that joined his through a guarded passage lay under a shelter of feather and fur. Their breath showed faintly in the air like the ghost of a candle blown out outside the chamber. The castle gathered the cold as a valley gathers water. The stairs kept the chill, the lintels kept it, the arrow slits gave it a path for the wind to find. Servants moved in the corridors with steps that did not wake the sleepers. They carried iron tools wrapped in cloth so the sound would not ring in the night. A boy with a coal scuttle opened the door no wider than his shoulder and crossed the room with careful feet. His hair smelled of smoke and dry wood. When he reached the hearth, he laid fresh logs on the coals and listened for the first quiet crack. An older woman lifted the nearest brazier with both hands and turned it so that its shallow fire faced the bed. She watched the flames pull at the air, and then she withdrew toward the shadows. Where the light did not reach, the work seemed simple. It was not simple. It was the difference between a room that could hold sleep and a room that would push the body back into wakefulness. The curtains around the royal bed did more than soften the view. They made a low tent inside a larger cave of stone. They held warm air near to the skin for a little while. The fabric was thick and worn in places by fingers that had drawn it night after night. The threads had the faint taste of dust, and the edges smelled faintly of the oil used to keep moths away. The quilts were made from wool that remembered the lanolin of the sheep. The furs kept the quiet of the animals from which they came. A layer of linen lay closest to the skin and held the warmth of the body as if it were a secret. Close by the bed stood a chair carved with patterns of leaves that no longer grew within sight of the castle. On the chair rested a folded robe trimmed with ermine. The white streaks caught the light like frost on a window. A pair of slippers waited beneath. They had been warmed at the brazier and then set aside so the lining would hold the heat. Until morning, the room held a few more signs of life. There was a table with a pitcher that could hold broth or spiced wine if the night demanded it. There was a small image of a saint placed near the hearth where the glow could find the face and make it seem awake. There was a narrow chest that kept letters tied in a ribbon and a comb made of bone that felt warm where a hand had held it. Only moments before sleep, at the far end of the chamber, a screen stood in front of a doorway that led to a garderobe and a washstand. Beyond that, a draft moved gently like the breath of the castle itself. It found its way around the edges of the screen and down along the stones, where it could lick at ankles if one stepped carelessly away from the fire. The king stirred. The bedding rose and fell. In that moment, he was neither ruler nor warrior. He was a man who desired rest and the promise that the cold could remain outside his skin. He reached for the edge of the coverlet. He drew it closer to his chin. He heard the last pine knot in the fire pop and give up a tiny fountain of sparks. He knew the sound of his own chamber. He knew the way the wind moved on a night like this. He had learned to hear where the cold waited, just as he had learned to hear where danger waited in a field or in a court of men. The queen breathed in, her room with a slow rhythm that could soothe a child. An attendant near her bed lifted her head at the sound from the hearth and then let it fall again. The stillness returned as if someone had placed a palm across the whole room. The castle carried the winter in every direction. In the stairwell, the skins of pheasants hung with a thin rim of frost at the tips of their feathers. In the small chapel, a candle burned and tilted under a draught that came through a seam in the door. In the barracks, a soldier pulled his cloak up to his nose and dreamed of a cottage that he would never own. In the kitchen, a pot of bones hummed and sent a thin line of steam toward the roof. In the stable, the warm breath of horses rose like small clouds and met the colder air with a quiet sigh. All of these sounds bent toward the same center. They bent toward the royal chambers, where the most careful order had been set to defeat. The night the stone did not yield. It never yielded. Yet human hands returned each day to the same effort. In the afternoon, they had drawn the shutters across the narrow windows. They had fitted the iron snugly against the wood. They had put the smallest staff member in the passage to feel where the wind found a way. They had hung tapestries along the wall to break the flow. The tapestry near the hearth showed a garden in full summer. Vines climbed a trellis. A woman in a red gown reached for an orange that would never ripen. The green in the cloth was deep and calm. It gave a promise to the eye that the skin could not accept. In the corner of the room, a basket held a little pile of warm stones that had sat near the fire. A servant would place them at the foot of the bed when the hour turned near dawn. The warmth would climb up the robes like a small animal looking for a place to hide. A visitor might think this was excess. A visitor might think the wealth of a crown showed itself here in a display of fur and velvet and carved wood. The truth was quieter. The truth was that every piece had been chosen to answer the same tyrant. The tyrant was cold. The court could debate the language of a treaty or the cost of a new war. The body would accept only heat. The chamber had been arranged to provide it with as little risk as possible. The brazier stood at a safe distance. The screen guarded the doorway where the draught was strongest. The bed faced the hearth so that the glow could rest on the curtains like a hand. The servants understood the order as if it were liturgy. They followed it without question because they, too, had learned what a night could take from a person who had nothing but breath to keep them warm. Near the hearth, a small pot held an ointment made from fat and herbs. If a cough broke the calm, the ointment could be warmed and rubbed on a chest to quiet the lungs. On the table, a bundle of dried lavender lay beside a cup and a small knife. The knife was not for defense. It was for the fruit that would be cut. In the morning, when the air had lost a little of its bite, the cup still held the imprint of the lip that had touched it before sleep. The mouth had left no stain. The warmth from the rim had already gone. The chair beside the bed caught a little of the firelight and sent it into the folds of the robe. The fur on the collar looked almost alive for a moment, as if it still heard the snow and remembered the track through the trees. The hour moved on. The wind outside changed its note. As if it had turned a corner, a bell far away in the tower counted the time. The sound came thinly through the stones. The king did not hear it, or if he heard it, he did not wake. The queen did not move. A servant crossed the room once more, checked the hearth, and placed one more small log upon the coals. A sparrow that had found a way into the roof weeks ago shifted above the ceiling and then fell still. The coal pressed its face to the window shutters and waited. The fire gave a small reply. The rune held this was the victory that mattered on a night like this. It was not the trumpet in the courtyard or the seal on a decree. It was not the sound of a gate closing or the clatter of armor. It was the quiet truth that a human body could keep its rest, despite the world that wanted to take it away. The chamber had been built to make this possible. It had been learned by practice and kept by vigilance. It would be tested again when the bell called the next hour. It would be tested again when dawn sent its cold fingers along the stone. For now it stood. It stood like a harbor under a sky of ice. It gathered into itself the small warmth of breath and ember and linen, and would not let it go. The castle rose against the hill like a giant frozen wave. Its towers caught the pale moonlight, and its walls seemed to drink in the cold. To the traveler who looked from the valley below, the fortress promised safety and power. To those who lived inside, it promised little comfort when winter reigned. The strength of stone was both shield and curse. It stood firm against enemies, but it welcomed frost into every seam and crack. The castle was made for war, not for warmth. Step through its gate on a winter night, and the air grows sharper rather than softer. Torches flicker, but the flame does little to fight the chill that seeps upward from the earth. The stones beneath the feet hold a memory of ice, and each breath carries the weight of dampness. Even in the great hall where fires roar, the warmth belongs only to the circle close to the hearth. Beyond that circle, shadows and frost stretch together, swallowing tapestries, tables, and men alike. It was within this unyielding world that the royal bedchamber became a sanctuary. The chamber was not large compared to the hall, but every surface was chosen with care. Tapestries lined the walls not only for splendor, but to keep the wind from crawling through the stones. The thick weave showed gardens, forests, and hunts that brought summer into the eyes if not into the skin. Beneath the tapestries, the wall still breathed cold, but the cloth held it back like a soldier holding a gate. The floors were covered with heavy carpets that muffled steps and stopped the icy air that climbed from the stones below. Each carpet had been carried across trade routes that stretched from the east, woven with dyes that remembered desert heat and markets filled with spice. Yet here, in the north, their service was humbler. They kept the toes of the queen from numbing as she crossed the room. They held the small measure of warmth that seeped from the braziers and the fire. The bed itself was the true fortress inside the fortress. Its wooden frame rose high, carved with patterns that carried both pride and faith. Within the frame lay the labor of many hands, a mattress stuffed with feathers, a quilt sewn with wool, furs drawn from forests where hunters had risked their lives. Curtains circled the bed, falling heavy as the drapes of a theater stage, turning the bed into a chamber within a chamber. Inside this tent, the air softened. A body could breathe without seeing its own breath. Sleep became possible. Servants tended the fire with discipline learned from childhood. Logs were chosen with care, dried through the summer, stacked in vaults. That kept them ready for nights like this. When the king lay down, the squires placed braziers at measured distances. Too near, and smoke or sparks might threaten cloth. Too far, and the heat would fade. Balance was everything. Some servants even lay upon the floor to wake when the fire grew low, so that the chamber never surrendered fully to the cold. Their dreams were shallow, but their loyalty was deep. Even so, the chamber remained fragile. The cold was cunning. It entered through the smallest gap round a shutter, through a crack in a lintel, through the very stones that sweated with dampness. The queen's attendants would walk with bare hands along the wall to feel where the wind whispered in. They would hang cloth or press wood against the seam. They would bring worn stones wrapped in linen and place them at the foot of the bed. For a few hours, the bed would feel like summer ground. By dawn, the warmth would vanish, and the battle would begin again. Luxury in this chamber was not gold, not jewels, not rare silks. It was the rare moment when the body forgot the cold. A night of uninterrupted sleep was more precious than the finest crown. Every object had a duty. Every curtain was an ally. The ointments by the fire guarded against coughs. The wine kept. In the pitcher gave strength when the cold entered the lungs. Even the lavender on the table had its purpose, for its scent calmed the restless body, allowing it to sink into slumber despite the frost at the walls. Thus, the royal bedchamber was not merely a place of rest. It was a fragile fortress inside. The larger fortress, where the enemy was not an army but the season itself. Each evening the chamber was prepared as though for a campaign. Fires were laid, curtains drawn, bedding arranged like armor. And when the king and queen surrendered to sleep, their attendants stood watch not against assassins or invaders, but against the slow and patient hand of winter. The castle, mighty in daylight, became something different at night. Its stones no longer spoke of victory, but of endurance. Its halls no longer rang with feasts, but with the quiet shuffle of servants guarding flame. In this silence, the bedchamber revealed itself as the heart of the struggle. It was there that power itself bent to necessity. A king might rule lands, a queen might guide dynasties, but both yielded to the same truth. Warmth was survival. Without it, crowns meant nothing. The memory of the great hall still lingered in the stones. In earlier centuries, it had been the only bedchamber a king required. There, in the wide space where fire roared at the center and smoke climbed toward the rafters, monarchs slept among their men. The hall was alive at all hours. Guards shifted in their posts. Attendants whispered in corners, and the crackle of the fire mingled with the coughing of those who lay on the floor. A king's rest was public. A queen's rest, if she had one at all in those early days, was separated only by a screen or a small chamber beside the hall. Privacy was rare. Comfort was scarcer still. The change began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like frost creeping across glass. By the 13th century, rulers grew weary of the cold that clung to the corners of their halls. They grew weary, too, of the endless company that never left them in peace. Edward I of England, stern in rule and sharp in war, was also practical. In life, he ordered separate chambers for himself and his queen. These were not vast, but intimate, enclosed with thick walls, designed not for display, but for survival. The shift marked more than architecture. It marked a new rhythm in how kings and queens lived their nights. Within these chambers, power took on a different shape. The king no longer drifted to sleep surrounded by the breathing of men who might carry both loyalty and ambition. He no longer woke to the noise of dozens stirring before dawn. Instead, he closed the curtains of his bed, and within that small circle of warmth he could reflect, conspire, or simply sleep without witness. The queen, likewise, gained a space of her own, where attendants could tend her needs without the constant presence of courtiers. This privacy changed the texture of rule. Decisions were whispered more often in bedchambers than in councils. Secrets clung to the heavy fabric of the drapes, carried out in the morning by the servants who overheard. The turning point was not only one of comfort, but of authority. The bedchamber became a stage for politics as much as for rest. Ambassadors might be summoned there in the early hours, greeted not in the hall of banners, but in a room where a king sat cloaked in fur beside a low fire. Queens held influence in these intimate spaces, speaking to their husbands away from the ears of courtiers. Letters were read, treaties discussed, and judgments weighed while the frost painted the windows. The warmth of the chamber was fragile, but the weight of decisions within it was immense. Life in the great hall had been communal, almost rustic despite its grandeur. Life in the chamber was deliberate. Every curtain drawn was a choice. Every brazier lit was a signal of care. Attendants learned new duties. They no longer guarded only the fire in the center of the hall. They guarded the silence of their monarchs. They became keepers of secrets, witnesses to the gestures of rulers when crowns were set aside. A chambermaid who brushed the queen's hair by candlelight knew more of her heart than 100 courtiers. A squire who laid furs upon the king's bed understood his weakness for warmth, a weakness that made him human. The architecture itself followed this new demand. Castles that once gloried only in their halls began to carve out suites of rooms. A solar for the queen, a privy chamber for the king, connecting passages that allowed them to meet in secrecy. Builders thickened walls and narrowed windows to hold heat. Fireplaces grew more elaborate, not merely as symbols, but as necessities. The hearth became the true crown of the room, without which all other splendor meant nothing. Imagine one of these nights in the 14th century. A storm lashes the battlements, snow sweeping across the towers. In the hall below, soldiers huddle together, sharing blankets and scraps of food. The fire burns but leaves the far end of the room. Icy, above them, in a chamber lined with tapestries. The king sits close to the hearth, while a counselor leans forward to whisper of unrest in distant lands. The queen, in her own apartment, listens as her ladies speak of the rising cost of wool and the merchants who grow bold. Decisions are made in these small rooms, decisions that ripple outward to villages and towns, shaping lives that will never glimpse the velvet curtains of a royal bed. The turning point lay in this contrast. Once, power slept in public, visible and vulnerable, dependent on the warmth of numbers. Now, power withdrew into silence. The chamber became both refuge and fortress, not against armies, but against the elements. And not only against the cold outside, but the cold of too much company. Kings and queens discovered that to rule effectively, they must first endure the night. And to endure the night, they must create a space where frost could not dictate their every breath. This transformation was not sudden, nor was it uniform. Some lords still clung to the hall, suspicious of withdrawal. Some courts valued the display of sleeping among subjects, proof of trust or dominance. Yet the tide turned. Privacy grew fashionable, then essential. The architecture of castles followed, and with it the habits of the age, from the smallest manor to the grandest fortress. Chambers multiplied. Warmth became not only a comfort, but a mark of rank. To sleep in solitude, wrapped in silence, was to sleep as royalty. And so the Great Hall, once the beating heart of medieval life, surrendered its nightly role. It remained a place for feasts, councils, and spectacles. But the intimate theater of survival moved elsewhere. The chamber claimed it. The bed, curtained and firelit, became the throne of winter nights. What began as a retreat from cold grew into a transformation of power itself. The warmth of the royal chamber was not contained by its walls alone. It carried outward, like ripples upon water, shaping the way others lived and slept. What began as a necessity for kings and queens became a pattern that nobles, merchants, and even villagers longed to imitate, each according to their means. The chamber, once a private refuge, grew into a symbol of status and survival in the castles of lesser lords. Private rooms began to appear beside the hall. These chambers were smaller, humbler, but their purpose was the same. Tapestries stitched with coarse wool hung upon the walls, and straw mattresses replaced feather beds. Curtains, when they could be afforded, were sewn from dyed linen rather than velvet. Yet to sleep apart, to sleep in relative warmth, was to taste the privilege of royalty. A noble who drew his curtain at night imagined himself in the company of kings. Merchants, too, sought such comforts as their wealth increased. Trade carried not only spices and cloth, but ideas. When a merchant returned from the fairs of Champagne or the ports of Italy, he often returned with a hunger for the softness of pillows or the weight of imported carpets. In their townhouses, far from the stone fortresses of nobility, they began to line walls with cloth, to build hearths with decorated montels, to demand feather beds from craftsmen who once worked only for courts. The echo of the royal chamber reached into the rising homes of cities. Even peasants, who had no hope of velvet or ermine, shaped their nights in response to this ideal. In cottages that crouched beneath the shadow of castles, families gathered close around a single hearth. Straw was piled thick beneath blankets woven of rough wool. Children lay side by side for warmth, while parents placed their bodies like shields against the draught that crept under the door. It was no royal chamber, yet the desire was the same: to carve a circle of warmth within a world that belonged to frost. The echo was not only in comfort, but in imagination. Songs and stories told of the king's bed hung with curtains, of the queen's furs soft as snow. These tales traveled farther than the goods themselves. A farmer's wife might never touch ermine, but she would dream of its softness as she sewed patches onto her family's quilt. A boy tending sheep in the fields might never see a chamber lined with tapestries, but he would picture them when he warmed his hands by a fire of brambles. The royal chamber became part of the collective mind, a distant but powerful image of how life might be if one could escape the grasp of winter dot. Yet within this echo lay a stark truth. Wealth softened the hand of the season, but it never removed it. A king wrapped in sable still saw his breath in the night. A merchant beneath goose feathers still heard the wind clawing. At the shutters, a peasant by the fire still felt the frost seep through the floor. The cold was democratic in its reach, though unequal in its cruelty. It reminded all that survival was not guaranteed. That warmth was a fragile prize won each evening anew. This shared struggle created a bond across classes, though few would admit it. When the king drew his curtain, when the merchant stoked his hearth, when the peasant huddled with his children, each performed a version of the same ritual. Each prayed in silence that the fire would hold until morning. Each carried the hope that the body would rest long enough to rise with strength for the day ahead. The echo of the chamber was not only social, but human, uniting high and low in the quiet defiance of sleep against the cold. Chroniclers of the age sometimes described the luxury of monarchs in tones. Of all, they wrote of beds large enough for men, of silks embroidered with gold, of jewels sewn into robes. Yet behind these embellishments lay the plain truth. All was arranged to chase away the cold. Even splendor bent to necessity. The crown glittered at feasts, but at night the crown mattered less than the ember glowing at the hearth. Subjects who read such accounts understood this, even if the writers did not. They knew that beneath the velvet and gold, the king and queen were as vulnerable as they docked the echo-shaped architecture, economy, and even faith. Chapels within castles grew warmer, lined with wood and cloth, for prayer could not rise easily from frozen lips. Markets adjusted to supply wool, fur, and feathers in ever greater measure. Pilgrims traveling to shrines carried blankets along with their offerings, knowing that a night without warmth could undo a journey of months. Everywhere the need for comfort spread, and everywhere the image of the royal chamber served as both model and myth. In this way, the silent chambers of kings and queens extended their reach. Far beyond their walls, they shaped how people imagined security, how they measured wealth, how they endured the season that ruled all. The echo was not one of grandeur, but of survival. It whispered through palaces and hovels alike. Warmth is life. The castle walls still stand. Some lie in ruins, open to the sky, their stones carpeted with moss. Others remain whole. Their chambers now quiet museums where footsteps echo. Visitors walk through them in summer, wearing light clothes, and still the cold rises from the stone. It is a reminder that these fortresses were never built to ease the body. They were raised to guard a crown. Comfort was a struggle, not a gift. Step into a preserved bedchamber, and the air feels heavier than in the courtyard. Curtains hang faded, but intact, once thick with velvet. A hearth yawns dark against the wall, and iron brackets still hold the places where braziers once burned. Guides speak of the furs and feather beds, of the tapestries that once glowed with color. Yet no description can fully convey the breath that clouded the air at night, or the silence when the fire fell low. The stones still know. They carry within. Then the memory of winters that tested both peasants and kings dot in our own time. We live surrounded by warmth we hardly notice. A switch on the wall brings fire without smoke. A pane of glass holds back the wind. A blanket of synthetic cloth weighs light, yet holds heat better than pelts, once prized by queens. We forget that warmth was once a daily battle, as vital as food for centuries. Sleep itself was uncertain until the fire was made. The curtains drawn, the coals watched. To rest through the night was to triumph. Yet there is wisdom in remembering that struggle. The royal chamber, with all its furs and feathers, reminds us that power does not erase need. Kings and queens bent before the same adversary as their subjects. Their crowns could not command the wind to cease, nor the frost to vanish. They survived because they prepared, they ordered, layered, and guarded against the season with patience. In that preparation lay a lesson as enduring as the walls themselves. No rule is so mighty that it can ignore the elements. The echo of their nights lingers in our imagination. We picture the heavy curtains falling, the fire glowing, the silence deepening. We sense the human fragility behind the crown, the simple desire to sleep without shivering. It is in such images that history speaks most clearly, not in battles alone, nor in treaties, but in the quiet endurance of bodies that longed for warmth. Even today, when storms cut power and darkness settles on modern cities, we catch a glimpse of that older world. Candles are lit, extra blankets piled, and we remember that comfort is fragile. For a few hours we live as they lived, measuring each ember, listening to the wind. In those moments, the line between present and past fades, and the chamber of a medieval king feels close to our own. The present reflection is not only nostalgia, it is also humility. We stand in heated rooms and imagine ourselves beyond the reach of nature, yet history whispers that this is an illusion. The frost still waits at the edge of the glass. The wind still prowls outside the walls. Kings once thought themselves eternal, yet their castles became cold shells. Only the memory of their struggle remains, a reminder that survival is the truest. Crowned up so when we read of tapestries and furs, when we see velvet robes in a museum case. Let us not see only splendor. Let us see the fear of a cold night, the breath of a monarch rising white in the dark, the hands of servants laying logs with quiet urgency. These are the details that join us to them across centuries. These are the details that reveal the shared truth of all lives. The silent chambers of winter are gone, yet they live on in our imagination. They tell us that behind the glitter of crowns lay the most human of battles, the struggle to sleep through the night, and they remind us that warmth, once won by fire and fur, remains the deepest comfort we seek. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. The bedchamber shimmered with a dim and steady glow, a fragile island of warmth surrounded by the endless frost of the castle. Logs crackled in the hearth, their resin releasing a faint sweetness into the air, mingling with the sharp scent of smoke that clung to velvet curtains. The fire was not a luxury but a necessity, the first line of defense against the cold that pressed against the shutters. Like an enemy at the gate, the flames whispered and hissed, rising and falling in a rhythm that felt alive, as though the room itself breathed only so long as the wood burned. The bed stood high upon its carved wooden frame, a fortress within a fortress. Its mattress was swollen with goose feathers, gathered through long summers and sewn into linen with meticulous care. Beneath the king or queen, the feathers yielded softly, embracing the body in a way the stone floor never could. Above, quilts and coverlets were layered thick, heavy as shields, their fabric dyed deep with colors of scarlet, emerald, and gold. On top of these lay furs, each with a history carried in its pelt. Sable from Russia, prized for its darkness and sheen. Ermine, white as the snow outside, hunted in distant forests and reserved for royal robes. Wolf pelts, rugged and thick, reminders of the wild that prowled beyond the castle walls. Together, they formed a barricade of warmth that wealth alone could command. Yet even this barricade was not enough to conquer the cold entirely. The breath of the sleepers rose faintly visible in the dark, thin clouds dissolving into the night air. The stone walls, vast and merciless, radiated their chill no matter how fiercely the fire burned. Curtains surrounded the bed, falling heavy and dark, enclosing the monarch in a cocoon of cloth. Inside that tent, the air softened, the heat lingered longer, and the dream of warmth became almost real. Servants understood the importance of these curtains as keenly as a soldier understood his armor. Each evening they were drawn carefully, sealed against the draught, their folds checked for gaps where the cold might creep in. Around the room, braziers glowed like sentinels. Iron bowls, filled with coals carried from the hearth, gave off a steady, low heat. They did not blaze like the fire, but they endured, keeping corners of the chamber from sinking entirely into frost. The smell of iron and ash mingled with the perfume of dried lavender placed nearby, meant to calm the mind and mask the acrid smoke. Attendants tended these braziers through the night, rising in silence to stir the coals, feeding them with small sticks to coax them back to life if they faltered. To sleep within the chamber was to depend upon this unseen labor. The Queen's ladies, stationed nearby, warmed stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth before placing them at the foot of her bed. For a brief hour the heat seeped upward through the quilts, a gentle tide against the night's invasion. The king's squires kept watch over the hearth, their ears tuned to the sigh of the fire, rising quickly when the crackle dulled Some slept lightly on rushes near the door, so they could wake at once if the flames grew faint. Their duty was as vital as any guard upon the battlements. For without fire the chamber would fall to the same frost that claimed the stables and barracks. Every object in the room carried meaning. The fur-lined robe draped across the chair was not merely a garment, but a shield for the journey. From bed to hearth, the slippers placed beneath the bed held warmth from the brazier so that the monarch's feet would not freeze upon touching. The stone floor, the goblet of spiced wine, resting on a small table, carried the promise of inner warmth, its cinnamon and cloves a fiery counterpart to the embers. Even the tapestries on the walls, embroidered with hunts and gardens, did more than please the eye. Their thick weave trapped air, forming a barrier against the draught. They were armor stitched into cloth. To enter such a chamber was to step into a carefully constructed defense. It was not extravagance for its own sake. It was survival ranged with precision. Each detail chosen to resist the same enemy. The splendor of velvet, the sheen of fur, the softness of feathers, these were not only signs of wealth, but answers to the cold. For all their crowns and titles, kings and queens were vulnerable when night fell. The chamber revealed this truth with quiet honesty. Beneath the layers, the monarch was a human body, fragile against frost, craving the same warmth that peasants sought around smoky hearths. In their cottages, the result of all this effort was a room that seemed to glow with quiet dignity. The fire painted the walls in amber light. Shadows danced on the tapestries, making the embroidered hunts come alive. The air near the hearth shimmered with heat, while the corners held their stubborn chill. The monarch slept, not in luxury as we imagine it today, but in a fragile balance won through endless labor. Warmth was never permanent. It had to be summoned, maintained, guarded. The fire must not die, the braziers must not cool, the curtains must not part, and yet, in those hours when the arrangements held firm, when the feathers embraced, the furs covered, and the fire sang softly, there was a sense of triumph. The castle, vast and cold, could not erase the small circle of heat the chamber preserved. The monarch, wrapped in fur and feather, resting in the glow of firelight, experienced not splendor, but a kind of peace. It was the peace of survival, of a body allowed to forget the cold for a few hours, of a night rested from the dominion of winter. This was the result, a chamber turned into a fortress against frost. Every detail an ally in the quiet war of sleep. It was not indulgence, but endurance. It was not fairy tale, but strategy. To survive the medieval winter was to weave fire, fur, and feather into a fragile crown greater than any of gold. The survival of kings and queens in their bedchambers did not rest on chance. It was the product of a long chain of curses, each woven into the daily rhythm of the castle. The fire that glowed in the hearth began its life months earlier in the forests, when peasants felled trees under the command of stewards. Wood was cut in summer, stacked in great piles, and left to dry beneath open sheds. Logs chosen for the royal chambers were the straightest, free of rot, and split with care so that they would burn evenly. By the time winter came, the stores of oak and ash stood ready like an army, each piece prepared to resist the cold. Furs, too, had their stories. The sable and ermine that covered a queen's bed were hunted in distant lands, often at great peril. Traders carried them across rivers and mountains, passing from the forests of Muscovy to the markets of Bruges and Paris. Each pelt was cured with smoke and salt, stitched by the hands of furriers who worked by candlelight, their needles pierced, hide after hide until a quilt of warmth was born. To touch such furs was to feel the labor of countless unseen lives, hunters, merchants, craftsmen, and beasts alike. Even wolf pelts, taken from the forests closer to home, carried danger in their capture. The echo of the hunt lingered in every fold, a reminder that warmth was won, not given. The goose feathers that filled the mattress and pillows came from the fields, gathered carefully during molting seasons. Women and children plucked them, often in long hours of work, their fingers red from cold water used to clean and soften the down. The feathers were dried, sorted, and sewn into linen sacks. A good mattress might require tens of thousands of feathers. To lie upon it was to lie upon a harvest measured not in grain, but in softness, gathered feather by feather over years. This was the quiet wealth of medieval Europe, the ability to gather what nature offered and transform it into comfort. Every detail of the chamber revealed the same pattern. The wine that waited on the table came from vineyards far away, its spices shipped along trade routes that stretched from the Levant. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg carried the heat of distant suns, their taste a reminder that warmth could be borrowed, even from foreign soil. The tapestries that covered the walls were dyed with colors extracted from plants and minerals. Through endless hours of boiling, pounding, and weaving, their scenes of gardens and hunts spoke not only of beauty, but of the countless hands that spun wool, knotted threads, and stretched cloth. Even the braziers of iron that glowed in the corners bore the marks of smiths who had hammered ore, until it yielded to their design. Each curve of the bowl, each handle forged to carry hot coals, was shaped by strength and sweat. Without these objects, warmth could not be kept. The fire might burn bright in the hearth, but the room would freeze. Without the braziers to carry its glow into shadowed corners. Thus, survival was not the work of a single flame, but of an entire chain of labor stretching across time and distance. Servants were the final link in this chain. Their movements, silent and practiced, turned resources into life. They split logs into smaller pieces, lifted coals into braziers, brushed curtains to check for gaps. Their ears grew sensitive to the sound of the fire, a log that hissed with too much sap, a coal that crumbled too soon, a flame that whispered of exhaustion. They warmed stones and slipped them under blankets. They placed slippers near the brazier and checked them with their hands before offering them to the queen. To serve in the royal chamber was not only a matter of loyalty, but of vigilance. A careless hand could let the fire die, and with it the fragile victory over the cold. Why such effort? Because the castle itself invited frost. Its stone walls absorbed the day's chill and exhaled it at night. Windows, even when shuttered, could not fully keep out the wind that searched for cracks. The height of the ceilings, built to impress and to defend, swallowed heat and kept it from the bodies that needed it most. Every advantage in war became a disadvantage in winter. Defense against arrows meant exposure to drafts. Height for watchtowers meant isolation from warmth. The very strength of the castle was the reason for its cold heart. Thus, the royal chamber became a counterweight to its own fortress. If the castle was designed for war, the chamber was designed for sleep. If the battlements spoke of power, the bed spoke of fragility. Within its curtains, the monarch was not a conqueror, but a mortal, shivering unless fire, fur, and feather were ranged in perfect order. The near cause of this survival lay not in the crown, but in the long procession of hands that cut wood, stitched pelts, plucked feathers, and tended flames. The lesson was clear even then. To command armies and govern kingdoms was one measure of power. To secure warmth enough to close one's eyes at night was another. Both required networks of loyalty and labor. Both depended on the diligence of those unseen. The chamber, filled with firelight and draped with furs, was not only a symbol of royal privilege. It was the most intimate theater of dependence. Every flicker of the flame, every quilt upon the bed, reminded the monarch that survival was shared, that life was stitched together from the work of many. And so the near cause of warmth was never a single object, but the union of all. Fire, furs, and feathers joined in harmony, carried by trade, sustained by labor, guarded by vigilance. In their presence the monarch slept. In their absence no crown could protect against the winter. There was a time when fire alone seemed enough. In the earliest centuries of the medieval world, the great hall carried the blaze of logs stacked high, and monarchs slept where the flames threw their longest light. The hall was alive with voices, footsteps, and the constant hum of human presence. Warmth came not only from the hearth, but from the very bodies gathered close together. Yet this warmth was shallow. Step only a few paces away, and the cold reclaimed its dominion. Privacy dissolved in smoke, and dignity was surrendered to necessity. The king who wished to dream alone could not. The queen who longed for silence could find only the murmur of others in restless sleep. The turning point arrived when fire revealed its limits. No matter how wide the hearth, no matter how high the flames, the hall could not hold the heat. Stone drank the warmth greedily and gave nothing back. The crown needed more than fire. It needed layers, barriers, and walls within walls. Thus began the transformation of sleeping customs. The monarch withdrew from the public hall into a chamber built for secrecy and for warmth. Curtains fell where once there had been openness. Furs spread where once straw had sufficed. Feathers were gathered, not merely for cloaks, but for beds that floated above the cold floor. This retreat marked more than a change in architecture. It marked a change in the very rhythm of power within the hall. The king's body had been a public symbol, visible even in slumber. The court saw his vulnerability and his strength mingled together in the glow of firelight. But within the chamber, his body vanished from view. Behind the heavy curtains of his bed, he became both more fragile and more untouchable. His breath no longer mingled with the breath of men. His warmth no longer came from their closeness. He claimed instead a circle of heat crafted from fur and feather. The queen, too, gained a chamber of her own. Her ladies attended to her with care, arranging braziers and stones, draping robes across chairs, no longer a shadow beside the king. In the hall, she became the center of her own quiet kingdom. In her chamber, politics mingled with warmth. Letters were read by candlelight. Counsel whispered among women who guarded secrets as carefully as quilts guarded heat. Thus, the private chamber did more than protect the body. It gave new shape to influence, allowing decisions to form in intimacy. Rather than in spectacle, the turning point extended outward. Nobles who visited the royal court returned to their own estates. With envy for these private retreats, they began to demand solas, chambers, and bed spaces set apart from the hall. Merchants in cities followed, building houses where fire warmed not only the common room, but also upper chambers lined with cloth. What began as necessity at the pinnacle of society trickled downward, altering the architecture of Europe itself. The very shape of homes bent toward the example of the royal bedchamber. But perhaps the most profound change was inward. The chamber taught rulers to imagine their nights differently. No longer was sleep a public act performed among subjects. It became a ritual of solitude. The king closed his curtains as he might close the gates of a fortress. The queen drew her furs as she might draw authority closer. The attendants, who once stoked a single whole fire for many, now tended multiple smaller fires for the few. Each ember was guarded like a secret. Each feather was valued like a coin. This transformation reshaped the way power was felt. The monarch was no longer only the figure who spoke in councils or rode into battle. He was the figure who rested behind curtains others could not part. His privacy became a symbol as strong as his crown. To be unseen was a new kind of majesty, and to be unseen was made possible only through the union of fire, fur, and feather. The turning point also revealed the fragility of rule. In the hall, the king had endured the same drafts as his men, the same smoke, the same restless stirrings. In the chamber, he admitted through his actions that even he could not face the cold. Without armor of a different sort, the furs upon his bed were as vital as the steel upon his body. The feathers beneath him were as necessary as the swords at his side. Power was not freedom from need. It was the ability to gather the means of survival when others could not. Imagine such a night. In the 14th century, snow drifts against the outer wall, muffling the world beyond. In the hall below, soldiers huddle in cloaks, their breath rising in clouds. The fire burns but leaves shadows vast and cold above. In the chamber, the king lies beneath furs stitched from dozens of lives, feathers cushioning his frame. The firelight glows on his curtains, and beyond them silence reigns. He is alone, yet supported by 1,000 unseen hands. The turning point lies here. In this contrast, the hall still breathes with hardship, but the chamber breathes with careful victory. Thus, the medieval world shifted its balance. Fire no longer stood alone as the answer to winter. It had allies: fur, feather, and curtain. Together they built a space where a ruler could endure the night with dignity. The turning point was complete when sleep itself became an act of command. To order warmth, to gather comfort, To surround oneself with silence, this became as royal a gesture as raising a sword or sealing a decree. The warmth of the royal bedchamber did not end with the monarchs who slept within it, like the faint glow of fire spreading from the hearth. Its influence moved outward, shaping society across ranks and distances. What began as a necessity in the cold stone chambers of kings and queens became a model that others longed to imitate, each according to their means. Nobles, ever eager to mirror their rulers, began to fashion private rooms within their own fortresses. Where once the great hall had sufficed, they now demanded solas and chambers. The tapestries in these spaces were humbler, woven by local hands rather than imported from distant looms, but they served the same purpose. Curtains were sewn from dyed wool instead of velvet, and wolf pelts stood in for ermine. Yet the desire was unmistakable, to claim a measure of warmth that marked them as distinct from the common crowd. To withdraw from the hall into a private chamber was to declare one's closeness to royalty, not only in blood but in comfort. Merchants in cities followed suit, as trade brought wealth. It also brought aspiration. A merchant who returned from Bruges with bolts of cloth would hang them on his walls as both decoration and insulation. Carpets from the Levant or Flanders lined floors that once knew only bare boards. Beds rose higher, stuffed with straw layered upon feathers, the best that could be afforded. In townhouses, the chamber became a new sign of prosperity. To offer a guest a private room warmed by a hearth was to boast of success more loudly than gold displayed in a chest. The echo reached even the countryside. Peasants could not dream of furs from Russia or feathers in such abundance, but they, too, sought ways to hold warmth. Families crowded closer to the hearth, placing straw mattresses atop raised platforms to avoid the damp that crept from the earth. Mothers stitched quilts from scraps of wool, patchwork armor against the frost. Fathers repaired shutters with whatever wood they could spare, battling drafts as surely as knights battled foes. The example of the royal chamber did not give them luxury, but it gave them an image, a dream to shape their own fragile defenses. The cultural echo was carried also in stories and songs. Minstrels who performed in markets spoke of kings sleeping beneath velvet, queens swaddled in ermine. Children listened with wide eyes, not envying the power of crowns so much as the warmth of such beds. Even the poorest could imagine the softness of feathers or the glow of braziers. And in imagining, they measured their own hardship. A peasant lying on straw felt the distance between himself and his ruler not only in wealth, but in warmth. The royal chamber became a metaphor for privilege, a distant fire seen across frozen fields. Yet in this echo lay a paradox, for while the chamber symbolized division, it also revealed a truth shared by all, whether monarch or peasant. Each night was a battle against the cold. The king drew curtains, the merchant stoked coals. The farmer pressed children close together under a single quilt. Each body longed for rest, each heart feared the frost. The rituals differed in detail, but not in essence. Survival was the common thread that bound all classes. Writers of the age, when they described splendor, often cloaked this reality. They wrote of gold-threaded tapestries, jeweled robes, and feather beds wide enough for many. Yet behind the flourish of description lay the simple function: warmth. Every jewel sewn into fabric, every stitch of gold thread was secondary to the cloth's ability to hold back the draft. Even in extravagance, necessity ruled. To modern eyes, the luxury of royalty dazzles. To medieval minds, it reassured. The king, too, needed warmth, and thus his struggles mirrored their own. Economies bent beneath the weight of this echo. Furriers thrived as demand for pelts grew among nobles and merchants. Feathers became a trade, commodity, gathered and sold in markets where once only grain mattered. Carpenters built higher bedsteads, smiths forged braziers, weavers labored longer to produce tapestries. Survival generated commerce, and commerce reshaped survival. The warmth of a chamber was no longer only a private affair, it was an engine that drove trade, labor, and even conquest. Wars were fought in lands where furs could be gathered, where timber for fires grew abundant. In this way, the royal bedchamber extended its influence across borders, far beyond its walls. The echo also reshaped architecture. Castles, manor houses, and townhouses all began to include more private spaces. Chimneys multiplied, their smoke rising like a map of survival above villages and towns. Windows grew smaller to resist the cold, while hearths grew grander to feed the hunger for heat. The design of homes across Europe carried the mark of the royal chamber, as if each household sought to mimic its fortress within. In all of this, the social echo spoke of longing and of inequality, but also of endurance. The monarch who slept beneath sable furs and the child who shivered beneath patched wool shared the same enemy. Their defenses differed, but their need was the same. The chamber of the king was the grandest echo, yet it was not a separate world. It was a louder voice in the same chorus, a brighter ember in the same winter. The chambers where kings and queens once slept have long since changed their purpose. Many stand as ruins, their walls open to the sky, ivy crawling across stones that once held tapestries. Others survive in palaces turned into museums, where visitors pass through with cameras and hushed voices. Yet even in summer, when the sun warms the courtyards outside, the air within these chambers remains cool, heavy, and still. The stones remember. They release a chill that lingers like a shadow of the winters endured centuries ago. Step into one of these preserved rooms, and the imagination awakens. Curtains no longer hang thick and dark, yet iron hooks still mark where they once fell. The hearth yawns empty, its ash long swept away, but one can picture the fire glowing, logs snapping, smoke rising toward a blackened chimney. Guides speak of the furs that draped the beds, of the goose feathers that filled the mattresses, of the quilts dyed with colors that have faded with time. What they cannot fully convey is the breath of a monarch visible in the cold, the restless stirrings of attendants tending the braziers, the unspoken fear that the fire might falter before dawn. In our own age, we live surrounded by warmth that requires little thought. A hand turns a dial and heat fills the room. Glass windows hold back the wind. Synthetic fabrics insulate more effectively than any fur. To us, warmth is invisible, reliable, nearly forgotten. Yet history whispers that this was not always so for centuries. Warmth was the fruit of endless labor, a fragile crown earned each night by vigilance. Kings and queens, despite their power, lived at the mercy of fire, fur, and feather. Remembering this struggle reshapes our sense of privilege. The crown may glitter in paintings, but the true luxury of monarchy was a night's rest without shivering. Behind every jewel lay a bed layered with pelts. Behind every robe lay a hearth guarded against the dark. The lesson is humbling. Power does not erase human need. The monarch who ruled armies still bent before the same winter that claimed peasants in their huts. The difference lay only in the defenses wealth could muster. And yet, in this echo of vulnerability lies a connection across time. When a storm cuts power in a modern city, when candles are lit and blankets piled high, we glimpse the medieval night once more. We listen to the wind pressing at the windows. We watch our breath in the air. And for a few hours, we live as they lived. Comfort becomes fragile again. And we remember that survival rests not on entitlement, but on preparation. In that moment, the line between past and present blurs, and we share the same humility that once filled the royal chamber. The chambers of old castles teach us another truth. Survival is communal. No monarch warmed themselves by their own hand. The fire required woodcutters, the furs required hunters, the feathers required pluckers, the braziers required smiths. Every ember in the hearth was the result of countless unseen labors. Today we rely on systems just as vast workers who maintain power lines. Factories that weave our blankets, ships that carry fuel across oceans. We are no less dependent than the monarchs who once drew their curtains against the draft. To reflect on their nights is to see our own more clearly. And so, when we stand in those chambers today, whether in ruin or restoration, we stand among ghosts of firelight. We feel the chill still rising from stone, and we remember that comfort was once a nightly battle. The story of fires, furs, and feathers is not only a tale of royalty. It is a tale of humanity itself, struggling for warmth against the cold indifference of stone and season. It is a reminder that the deepest crowns are not of gold but of heat, and that the truest victory is a night of rest won from the grip of winter. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. The transformation of medieval life can be read most clearly in silence. Walk into the ruins of an old fortress today, and the difference between past and present presses close upon the skin. The great hall, once the center of warmth, noise, and nightly gathering, stands empty. Its high roof yawns like the mouth of a cave. The fire once kindled in the middle of the floor has long gone out, and the stones carry only a residue of cold. This emptiness is more than ruin. It is the imprint of change. The hall that had once been bedchamber, banquet, and council all at once surrendered its nightly role. The king and queen withdrew, and the chamber took its place. In the earliest centuries of castles, the great hall was everything. It was the place of feast, the space of judgment, the arena of storytelling. By day, courtiers, knights, and servants thronged its benches. By night, bedding was laid on rushes and many slept together upon the floor. Even monarchs endured this arrangement, their canopies raised only a little higher, their bedding only a little richer. Smoke from the central hearth curled upward, but the warmth did not travel far. The night belonged to draughts and shadows, to the snore of men and the restless stirring of women, to the dogs that prowled and curled by the fire. Privacy dissolved into the smoke, and comfort scattered like sparks in the wind. The result that later ages produced appears almost inevitable in hindsight. By the 14th century, the monarch no longer lay down among many. He entered a chamber built apart, a space drawn inward, guarded by thick walls, tapestries, and curtains. The chamber was smaller than the hall, but within it heat could gather, and silence could reign. The queen, too, gained her own rooms, furnished with her attendants, her hearth, and her privacy. The hall, once bedchamber and throne alike, surrendered its nightly purpose. It became stage by day, but the chamber became sanctuary by night. To enter one of these chambers today, preserved in stone or half-ruined, is to feel the intimacy that replaced the old exposure. A smaller hearth blackens one wall. Hooks remain. Where curtains once hung around the bed, the space feels human-scaled, protective, almost tender compared to the cavernous hall. Here, decisions were whispered before the fire died. Here, the king removed his crown and sank into feathers and fur. Here, the queen let silence settle around her like another quilt. The chamber enclosed what the hall had once displayed. The result was more than comfort. It was a reordering of perception. The monarch's body became less public, less shared, more distant. Where once subjects might glimpse him dozing in the glow of the hall, now they knew only that he withdrew behind doors. Power acquired a veil. Authority took on mystery. The chamber made the ruler invisible at the very hour when he was most vulnerable. Distance itself became part of majesty. The result can be measured also in architecture. Great halls remained necessary, but no longer sufficed. Castles grew to include suites of rooms, apartments arranged to give choice and separation. Builders set chimneys into walls, added flues, carved windows smaller. Corridors twisted to lead from hall to chamber, from public to private. The building itself acknowledged that survival and dignity both required withdrawal. This was no accident of design. It was a deliberate answer to centuries of cold endured in the halls. The chamber also marked the boundary between day and night in sharper ways. The hall was never silent. Even at its quietest, it carried the stir of many. But the chamber could be sealed, doors closed, curtains drawn, braziers placed, attendants dismissed. The ruler could step away from spectacle and into seclusion. Sleep became something protected, not merely stumbled into. Dreams themselves took place in privacy, no longer in a hall of murmuring voices. The result was deeper than architecture. It was psychological. It reshaped the monarch's sense of self and the subject's sense of distance. The hall in its older life had been a theater of humanity. Snores mingled with prayers. The smell of smoke mixed with sweat and wool. Dogs padded between sleeping. Men, their paws clicking on stone, curling finally into balls of fur near the warmth. A harp might rest against a bench, strings still trembling faintly from songs sung hours earlier. A jug overturned on the rushes let out the scent of ale. Such details painted the hall with vivid life, yet they also revealed the absence of boundary. Sleep in the hall was never wholly sleep. It was half wakefulness, half exposure. A reminder that even in rest the monarch belonged to the crowd. By contrast, the chamber smelled of polish and smoke, of lavender laid upon linen, of resin burning in pine logs. Instead of a crowd, there was arrangement. A brazier stood here, a chair there, curtains drawn to shape the space. The intimacy was as deliberate as the hall's openness had once been casual. In that shift of smell, sound, and sight lay the evidence of a society turning inward. Where once community had been the blanket, now fabric and fur performed the task. The result was an enclosure not just of the body, but of identity. It is tempting to imagine that such a change happened only for comfort. But deeper currents were at work. A ruler who lay among his men was a ruler bound by shared hardship. A ruler who withdrew was a ruler who claimed difference. Privacy became not only an answer to cold, but a statement of status. Distance equaled dignity. That message spread outward through nobles, merchants, even peasants who reshaped their homes in imitation. The chamber was not only a room, it was a symbol, a signal of change, a proclamation of separation between ruler and ruled. Modern visitors sense this even without words. They walk from the cavern of the hall into the narrow stair that leads to the chamber. The air itself changes. Footsteps no longer echo, but fall softly. Light no longer scatters, but glows in pockets. The body relaxes, without noticing, as if instinctively grateful for walls that do not swallow heat. These are the results of choices made centuries ago. They remain carved into stone, whispering still of the night when monarchs ceased to share the cold of the hall and claimed instead the guarded warmth of the chamber. To stand in such places is to stand at the boundary between worlds, the world of exposure and the world of seclusion. The result of the shift from hall to chamber was not simply architectural. It was emotional, psychological, cultural. It taught people to imagine space differently, to value privacy, to see warmth as more than accident. In that teaching lies one of the most lasting legacies of medieval life. When we reflect upon this shift, we see the Great Hall now as a monument of the past. Its emptiness tells us what has been lost. The communal closeness, the warmth of bodies, pressed together, the sense of ruler and subject sharing the same cold. But it also tells us what has been gained: privacy, warmth, distance, and the ability for monarchs to be human in their rest. The result was both loss and gain, each carried in the stones that still stand. Walk through such halls and chambers today, and the difference is palpable. The hall echoes with wind. The chamber still holds silence. The hall swallows warmth. The chamber protects it. The hall displayed vulnerability. The chamber concealed it. This is the result, written not in words but in stone. The shift from the hall to the chamber, from public to private, from exposure to seclusion. It is a change that shaped the nights of kings and queens, and through them, the life of an entire age. The shift from hall to chamber was not born of whim. It rose from causes close at hand. Causes felt in the marrow of winter nights and written into the daily rhythm of castles. The great hall had carried centuries of life, but its very scale betrayed those who sought rest within it. Stone walls drank heat faster than fires could give it. Rafters soared high above, swallowing warmth into darkness. Drafts stole across the floor like prowling animals, lifting rushes and stirring cloaks. Even when the hearth blazed, the cold returned before the firewood had turned to ash. For monarchs, the inconvenience grew unbearable. To command armies and govern realms while sleeping half-frozen among courtiers was more than indignity. It was weakness. A body that shivered could not rule with strength. A voice made hoarse by smoke could not carry across a council. The near cause of retreat into private chambers lay in this constant contest with stone and wind. Fire had limits, and bodies pressed together offered only fleeting relief. A smaller space was required, one that could be enclosed, guarded, and ordered against the night. Architecture responded first. Builders carved new rooms into existing walls, set smaller hearths along corridors, raised chimneys to draw smoke away. Windows narrowed until they became slits, easier to shutter against gusts. Floors were covered with timber rather than bare stone, trapping heat beneath boards. Walls were hung with tapestries not only for splendor, but to still the draught. The chamber was a solution crafted step by step. 1,000 small choices answering the cry of cold feet and aching lungs. Furnishings carried the effort further. Beds rose high above the ground, raised on carved frames to escape dampness. Curtains fell thick around them, creating a microclimate within the larger room. Feather mattresses were laid where straw had once sufficed, each one the result of thousands of down plucked, washed, and sewn. Quilts multiplied, furs draped heavy across the whole. Servants tested every layer, making adjustments with the care of soldiers preparing armor. The bed became not only a place of sleep, but a fortress, and the monarch entered it like a commander entering command. The queen's chamber revealed the same necessity. Ladies warmed stones at the hearth and slid them into linen sacks for her feet. Braziers glowed at corners, tended through the hours by attendants who barely slept. Oils and ointments were kept at hand to ease coughs stirred by cold air. Goblets of spiced wine or broth waited by the bed. Remedies against chill. Each night unfolded like ritual, repeated until it became law. Fire laid, curtains drawn, furs spread, stones warmed. The routine was the near cause of survival, enacted with a discipline that mirrored campaigns in the field. Beyond comfort, politics pressed upon the change. The hall exposed the monarch to the gaze of many, even in vulnerability. Enemies within court could see a king weary, hear him cough, mark him shiver. Privacy was armor as surely as fur was. Withdrawal to the chamber shielded not only the body but the image of strength. The hall's openness had once been proof of closeness between ruler and ruled. By the later Middle Ages, such openness threatened majesty. Distance was required, and distance could be created only in rooms apart. Trade routes strengthened the transition. With the flow of furs from the Baltic, feathers from farms, and textiles from distant markets. It became possible to outfit chambers with defenses unknown to earlier kings. Wealth could be translated into warmth, and warmth into dignity. Merchants carried not just goods, but the promise that monarchs might sleep without shivering. Each bolt of cloth hung upon a wall, each pelt stitched into a coverlet, was testimony to trade as much as to royalty. The chamber grew out of commerce as surely as it grew out of stone. Servants themselves were part of the cause. Their labor was the unseen wall between cold and sleep. Boys carried coals from hearth to brazier. Women stitched new curtains. Squires rose at intervals to feed logs to the fire. The survival of the royal chamber rested on their vigilance. If one link faltered, the cold entered and the illusion of comfort shattered. Monarchs knew this dependence well, though they rarely voiced it. The chamber was both fortress and confession. Even kings needed the hands of many to keep one flame alive. The hall, in contrast, resisted such discipline. Its openness meant drafts could never be tamed. Its size meant fire was always inadequate. Even in times of plenty, the hall felt half-starved of warmth. As winters lengthened during the Little Ice Age, the inadequacy grew sharper. Rivers froze, harvests failed, and cold pressed harder. Monarchs could not afford the sickness that came. From smoke-filled halls and nights of poor rest, the chamber was not indulgence. It was adaptation to climate itself. Thus, the near cause of the shift lay not in luxury, but in survival, stone, smoke, draft, distance, trade, labor, climate all pressed together, urging the monarch inward. The chamber was born of necessity, and once born, it grew quickly. To lie in the hall seemed unthinkable by the 15th century. The chamber had become not only the answer to cold, but the definition of dignity. The hall had long been the heart of the castle. Within its walls men feasted, sang, pledged oaths, and, when darkness fell, spread their cloaks upon rushes to sleep. Kings once shared this space, their beds raised upon a dais, visible to all. The fire roared in the center, its smoke gathering thick under the rafters before escaping through a vent. Warmth was fleeting, privacy non-existent, and the night a shared condition. For centuries this arrangement seemed natural, but slowly change pressed in, until the turning point came when the hall could no longer contain the needs of rulers, or the image of majesty they sought to project. The first hints appeared in the 13th century. Monarchs began withdrawing into smaller chambers beside the hall, spaces called solas or private apartments. Edward I of England, stern and practical, ordered such chambers in his castles, seeking rest beyond the reach of draught and noise. In France, the Capetian kings built suites of rooms where their queens could preside in greater dignity. What began as exception became expectation. By the 14th century, to find a monarch sleeping in the open hall was already old-fashioned, even unthinkable. The turning point was not only architectural, but symbolic. In the hall, the monarch's body was shared, his breath mingled with courtiers, his snores carried across the chamber, his weariness visible to all. In the private chamber, his body became hidden. Curtains enclosed him, walls sheltered him, Attendants guarded the threshold, power transformed. What had once been displayed was now veiled. The mystery of monarchy grew deeper in the silence of the chamber. Consider the difference in sound. In the hall, night was filled with the crackle of fire, the cough of soldiers, the shifting of dogs, the muttered prayers of servants. In the chamber, sound diminished to the low sigh of embers and the rustle of quilts. Silence itself became a form of wealth. To sleep without hearing the stirrings of many was a privilege, reserved for the highest. The turning point lay in this rediscovery of silence, that it could protect, dignify, and strengthen as much as walls or swords. The Queen's experience also shifted. No longer a shadow in the hall, she claimed apartments of her own, richly furnished, where she received her ladies, read letters, and prepared for bed away from the bustle. Within her chamber she shaped influence differently, through private counsel rather than public presence. The turning point gave women of rank new spaces in which their power could take subtler, but no less enduring forms. Attendants adapted quickly. Instead of tending a single large hearth for many, they managed multiple smaller fires, each dedicated to a lord or lady. Their skills multiplied, arranging curtains, warming stones, balancing braziers. The intimacy of the chamber required discretion. A chambermaid might hear whispers of politics. A squire might witness gestures of affection or fatigue. In these spaces, servants became the silent keepers of secrets. The turning point reshaped not only architecture, but the very web of trust. Within households, architecture itself testified to the change. Castles added towers with private suites, corridors twisted, separating public rooms from secluded ones. Chimneys multiplied, their smoke rising like testimony to the new hunger for private fires. The great hall remained, still essential for feasts and councils. But it no longer defined the night. The chamber claimed that role, and in claiming it, it redefined what it meant to rule. The turning point is most visible when we compare ruins today. Walk through a castle and the hall gapes wide, exposed, a cavernous reminder of communal life. Then step into the remains of a chamber, a smaller hearth, window seats, hooks for curtains. The contrast is stark. One space swallows sound and heat. The other gathers both. One space speaks of public spectacle, the other of private survival. This was the choice monarchs made, and it marked a cultural threshold as decisive as any battle. Philosophically, the turning point revealed a truth long present but seldom admitted. Kings and queens, despite crowns, were mortal. They needed warmth, silence, and privacy as any soul did. The hall had obscured this by binding them into the shared hardship of many. The chamber admitted it openly by constructing barriers against exposure. This honesty, paradoxically, increased their aura. Distance became majesty. To know that the king was hidden behind curtains made him seem more untouchable, not less. Thus, the hall surrendered its knightly crown. It remained stage and symbol, but the chamber became sanctuary. From this turning point onward, royal life was split, public by day, private by night, open in spectacle, veiled in rest. The shift was not a small adjustment. It was a redefinition of space, authority, and humanity. The hall that once embodied all functions was dethroned, and the chamber ascended in its place. The change that moved monarchs from the great hall into private chambers did not remain contained within castle walls. Like ripples from a stone cast into a still pond, the shift spread outward through noble households, merchant homes, and even the cottages of peasants. What had begun as a practical retreat from cold and noise became a cultural pattern that redefined how people imagined space, privacy, and dignity. Nobles imitated their rulers first. A lord who had once slept among retainers in a communal hall now demanded his own chamber, draped with cloth and furnished with a smaller hearth. Curtains hung around his bed. Tapestries covered stone walls, and attendants guarded the threshold. The imitation was not mere vanity. It was necessity reframed as privilege. To sleep apart was to mark oneself as closer to the monarchy, to participate in the same rhythm of life that kings and queens had claimed for themselves. By the 14th century, no noble household considered itself complete without at least one private solar where the lord or lady could withdraw. Merchants soon followed. As trade filled coffers, houses grew more elaborate. Where once a shopkeeper might have slept above his store, he now built chambers apart from the common room. Carpets from distant markets lined floors. Feather beds appeared in towns far from royal courts, and curtains divided spaces once wholly open. To offer a guest a chamber with a bed and a brazier became a mark of status, proof that prosperity had remade daily life. The echo of royal withdrawal spread into the rising middle classes, changing the very architecture of European towns. Even peasants, though unable to imitate fully, felt the pull of this change. Families continued to huddle around central hearths, yet they began to build alcoves, partitioned spaces, or raised platforms where parents or elders might claim a measure of privacy. Straw mattresses were piled thicker. Quilts stitched from scraps of wool imitated the layering of noble beds. Though they lacked the wealth of kings, they carried the same desire to carve from the cold a circle of warmth and intimacy. In every cottage, as in every castle, the need for sleep shaped the shape of space. This echo was not only physical, but cultural. Songs and tales began to describe monarchs withdrawing into chambers, their beds draped with velvet, their furs gleaming. In firelight, the imagery carried weight far beyond the castle. Listeners in villages and towns imagined these scenes, measuring their own hardships against the luxury of rulers. Yet they also recognized the similarity beneath the difference. Kings and peasants alike fought against drafts, coughs, and restless nights. The chamber became both symbol of separation and reminder of shared humanity. The echo influenced economics as well. Demand for furs, feathers, tapestries, and furniture increased. Hunters in distant forests trapped ermine and sable. Merchants carried goods across long routes. Craftsmen in towns produced bedsteads, curtains, and chests. Survival fueled commerce, and commerce reshaped society. Markets grew not only from hunger for food, but from hunger for warmth. The chamber, with its layers of fabric and fur, was a microcosm of trade, each object within it carrying the labor of many hands. Architecture across Europe bore the marks of the change. Manors, Townhouses and even modest homes began to include chambers separate from communal spaces, chimneys multiplied, walls thickened, windows narrowed. Privacy became a goal of construction, as important as defense once had been. The cultural echo had turned into material fact. Walk through villages of the later Middle Ages and one sees houses with separate sleeping rooms. Testimony to the influence of the royal chamber upon every stratum of society. Yet inequality remained sharp. A king's chamber glowed with braziers and furs from distant lands. A peasant's alcove offered only straw and patched wool. Still, the ritual was the same: to retreat, to cover, to protect the body against the cold. The echo reminded all that survival was universal, even if its means were not. And it carried a subtle lesson that dignity lay not only in crowns, but in the ability to rest, however humbly, within walls that offered respite from the night. The social echo also altered ideas of self. The whole had bound people together, reducing privacy to nothing. The chamber taught people to imagine themselves apart, to value the individual experience of sleep, silence, and warmth. Over generations, this changed the way society thought about space and identity. From monarchs to merchants, from nobles to peasants, the chamber created an inwardness that the hall could never permit. Thus, the shift from hall to chamber was not only a story of kings and queens. It was a story of an entire society learning to reshape its nights. What began as necessity for rulers became aspiration for all. The echo of that change lingers still in the very way we build homes to day rooms apart. Doors to close, curtains to draw, warmth guarded within walls. The ruins of Europe still tell the story. Walk into a castle and you will find the great hall standing vast and hollow, its high roof echoing with the sigh of wind. Step further and you will discover chambers smaller, darker, yet more intimate. The contrast is as sharp now as it was 6 centuries ago. The hall feels like theater abandoned, while the chamber feels like memory preserved. Each space whispers of a time when kings and queens altered how they lived their nights, and in doing so, altered how society imagined the very act of sleep. Modern visitors often marvel at the grandeur of halls. They picture banquets, tournaments, and the splendor of courts. Yet, if they linger, they feel the cold rising from the stone floors, the emptiness that no fire could fill. They sense that to lie down upon those rushes at night would be no comfort, even with the fire blazing. Then, in the preserved chambers, they find traces of another life, fireplaces blackened with soot, narrow windows shuttered against wind, iron hooks still fixed to walls where curtains once fell. In these intimate spaces, imagination awakens. Here a king drew furs around his body. Here a queen whispered counsel by firelight. Here, survival felt attainable, not impossible. In our own time, the difference feels almost immeasurable. We close a door, turn a dial, and warmth gathers without thought. Curtains are drawn for decoration rather than survival. Privacy is assumed rather than earned. Yet the stones remind us that such comfort is recent, fragile, and not to be taken for granted. For centuries, the struggle of night was universal. Rich and poor alike measured their rest by the strength of fire and the thickness of cloth. The present reflection reveals both distance and continuity. We are distant from the hardships of medieval nights. We do not sleep in smoke-filled halls, nor fear drafts through arrow slits. Yet we remain bound by the same desire to enclose ourselves, to draw warmth, to guard silence. Our homes are filled with chambers, our lives shaped by the expectation that rest is private. The medieval shift from hall to chamber echoes still in our architecture, in our culture, in our very sense of what it means to belong to oneself at night. There is also humility in this reflection. Kings and queens, with all their crowns and courts, retreated into chambers not for splendor, but for survival. They, too, felt the cold, coughed in the smoke, and longed for silence. Their privacy was not indulgence, but necessity, born of the same fragility that still marks us when storms cut power in modern cities and candles are lit. When families gather in one room for warmth, we catch a glimpse of that older world. We remember that warmth is not a guarantee, but a gift. That survival has always demanded vigilance. The stones also remind us that change begins with small causes. Drafts that crept across floors, smoke that stung eyes, shivers that shook bodies. These mundane discomforts reshaped architecture, culture, and identity. The whole, for all its grandeur, yielded to the chamber because the body demanded it. History often turns not on battles alone, but on beds, not on crowns alone, but on curtains. The present reflection allows us to see dignity not in the spectacle of power, but in the quiet endurance of sleep preserved against cold. To walk through these places today is to walk among lessons. The hall warns of exposure, the chamber promises enclosure. The hall reminds us of community, the chamber of individuality. Both are necessary, yet their balance shifts with time. Medieval monarchs taught us that privacy, once unknown, could become a cornerstone of life. Their chambers, fragile though they were, became the ancestors of every bedroom we know. And so, the shift from hall to chamber endures not only in ruins, but in us. Every closed door at night, every drawn curtain, every bed arranged with layers of cloth carries the echo of that transformation. We are heirs of their adaptation, even if we have forgotten its cost. The present reflection asks us to remember, and in remembering, to see our comfort as a triumph built on centuries of struggle. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. The corridor kept the cold as if it were an heirloom passed from century to century. Each step returned a mild echo that slipped along the walls and faded near the next arch. The air carried the damp smell of mortar and the faint bitterness of extinguished pitch. On winter nights, the stones released a breath like water drawn from a deep well. A king leaving council drew his robe closer. A queen on her way to a private chapel lowered her veil and steadied her breath. The corridor did not hate them and did not serve them. It performed its old duty of keeping what the season gave and sending that offering along the floor. Firelight never lived here for long. A torch brightened a short span and then surrendered to the broader dark that pooled between. Doorways. Shadows wavered on the lime wash and settled in the curves where ribs met ceiling. The floor showed its bare face except on feast days when rushes were laid. The stones were smooth where feet had passed for generations, and they were colder for that use. Servants hurried with covered braziers that hummed softly. Guards walked with measured steps, so the iron of their points would not clang against the wall. The corridor accepted them without favor and returned the sound of their work. With calm indifference, the passage had its own small weather. A draught entered by a slit window and ran the length of the wall like a river in a narrow bed. It curled in an alcove, pressed low at the ankles, and slipped away down the stair. On some nights, it carried the smell of snow and iron. On others, it brought a wet odor from the well yard and a faint sweetness from the stable hay. The stone remembered everything and kept those traces as a book keeps its marks. It kept the sway of distant bells. It kept the quick footfall of a messenger who once carried news that could not wait until dawn. This was the result of the fortress creed. Strength came first and comfort came later, if it came at all. Corridors joined towers and let watchmen move under protection. They led from gatehouse to hall and from hall to stair, so that no one need cross an open yard in a storm. They were narrow so a small guard could hold them. They were faced in stone because timber burned and the enemy loved fire. Such reasons could not be argued with, and yet they drew a winter tax that no treasurer could lessen. The corridors kept their frost and demanded payment in shivers and in patience. A monarch learned to read these passages as a captain reads the wind on an open field. When council ended, the king did not linger under the smoke that sagged above the fire. He gathered his robe and left before talk could pull him into a second debate. In the corridor, he matched his steps to his breath so the cold did not break it into gasps. He placed his fingertips on the wall once, a habit born not of fear but of respect for the stone that had carried him since youth. He did not speak there. He let the passage keep its own counsel while he preserved his strength for the next room. Where warmth waited, the queen kept another order that had its own quiet dignity. Before she stepped out, her ladies brought a robe lined with fur and warmed before a brazier. She held her hand above the lining to test the heat and nodded when it rose like a small tide. Another lady raised a lamp whose flame hid behind a thin shield of horn. The light was soft and golden, and it caught old scratches in the masonry, marks left by hands and shoulders over many seasons. They walked without haste. Silence gathered around them like cloth. Small things mattered most in that. Cold, the even pace, the guarded light, the robe that held its warmth for 30 steps and no more. On other nights, the passage offered only trial. Snow found a door that did not close tight and laid a thin band of melt across the threshold. Torchlight struck the water and made it glow like a small wound. Condensation ran down the wall and drew dark lines along the joints. A hurried step found that wetness and slid. A guard caught the elbow of a noble whose courtesy would not have reached so far in daylight. In that instant, rank bowed to an older law. Winter ruled here, and all who entered obeyed without question. Even so, the corridor taught discipline. It asked that every journey be prepared before the latch lifted. Slippers waited near the bed and were warmed by braziers that glowed like small red moons. A robe hung on the inner peg beside the door. A hood lay on the chair. a cup of spiced wine sat under a cover to keep its heat. When the door opened and the passage sent in its first breath, the hands knew what to do. The robe rose to the shoulders, the hood was drawn, and a swallow was taken for courage before the first step. There was beauty here for those who looked slowly. Moonlight came through a narrow slit and laid a pale stripe upon the floor. Frost grew along the lower stones in patterns as delicate as stitches in a hem. Iron rings set into the wall held a faint halo of ice. The torch left a resin scent that was not unpleasant. Somewhere a rope creaked once in its pulley and then fell quiet. Somewhere water dripped in the well shaft and counted time. The corridor kept such small music for anyone who would walk without haste. The result of all this was nightly humility. Kings and queens might seal decrees by day and send men to distant borders. They might receive tribute and wear garments that took a year to make. At night the corridor asked the same duty it asked of a stable boy with a bucket in his hands. Step carefully, keep the robe close, mind the draft. Trust the light that you carry and do not hurry for the visitor who walks these passages now. The lesson waits unchanged. The edges of the stones have softened, but they have not forgotten their work. A hand laid upon them does not find warmth. It finds the long memory of frost and the calm that comes from accepting it. The corridor remains proof that castles were made for more than ceremony. They were made to endure. The passage reminds the living that endurance is slow and patient. It is a matter of steps taken in order and of breath kept even until the door closes on the far side. The cold that lived in castle corridors began with a vow. A fortress was sworn to endure, not to ease. Every choice a builder made kept that vow. Stone was taken from quarries because fire does not eat it and arrows do not wound it. Stone holds the weight of towers and the anger of winter without complaint. But it also keeps what the night lays upon it. A wall that will not burn will not warm. It absorbs the day like a miser and returns little. Anyone who walked a passage in January felt the thrift of that decision in the bones of the feet and in the breath that turned white. Openings were cut sparingly because every gap was an invitation to weakness. Windows narrowed too, slits so that an archer could answer danger without giving danger a door. Light entered as a blade, not as a flood. Heat did not enter at all. Shutters helped, yet would never sealed against stone as a lid seals a jar. There was always a seam, and the seam always found a draught. Doors were thick with iron and good at stopping a ram. But when they swung on their hinges, they pulled wind. Like bellows, the corridor breathed through these small mouths, and the breath it drew was winter's breath. The plan of the building gave the cold its path. Corridors were threaded along outer walls where the masonry was thickest. Stairwells rose like open wells and drew air upward with a pull that could be felt even by a child. When a porter unlatched a door below, another door sighed above. The passageway exhaled at one end and inhaled at the other. Whatever warmth bodies and torches tried to leave behind was carried away. In that invisible tide, the house moved its air as a living thing moves its blood. And the corridors were the arteries where no heart ever beat fast enough to make heat. Defense shaped the corridors more than hospitality. A bend breaks a charge, so corridors bent. Corners gathered drafts the way pockets gather lint. A narrow run is easy to hold, so the walls pressed in until shoulders brushed stone and learned its temperature by unwilling study. Arches kept the roof from falling and made graceful ribs. But between those ribs small hollows formed where the wind could turn in circles. What saved a king from a rush of armed men also saved the cold from dispersing. Safety was bought in coin minted by winter, and the ledger that tracked the payment was the passage itself. Fire, the friendly answer to hardship, could not be trusted here. An open flame in a corridor is a thread that can run through the whole house and pull disaster after it. For that reason, heat was rationed. Braziers were permitted only under a keeper's eye, and they were moved like sentries instead of left to idle. Torches served sight, not warmth. They lit the air and gave backlight no thicker than a blade. A torch told a traveler where the wall stood, but did not change what the wall felt like. The rules that preserved the building preserved the cold as well. Water had a place in the cause. Many castles kept their wells within the walls so that siege would not cut the throat of thirst. Moist air crept up those shafts and slipped into passages by tiny roads in the mortar. On damp days the stone sweated. On frozen nights that sweat turned to glass. A prudent mason laid a gentle fall in the floor to guide water toward a drain. But the fall was never a river. Drops beaded, broke, and formed again. Feet learned to slow. Hands learned to touch the wall. In that slow schooling the corridor taught a lesson that no feast ever taught, which is that haste and stone do not love each other. Maintenance offered smaller causes that multiplied. Straw and rushes were avoided in passages because they hid coals and knives. Sand was scattered where condensation liked to gather, and once damp it cooled the air further. Lime wash sealed the stone against rot and reflected a little light to comfort the eye. Yet it left a fine dust that stung a throat already bitten by the season. Rules forbade clutter. No piles of wood to nestle heat. No benches to shelter a warming hand. No curtains heavy enough to drink the draught. Order defended life and banished ease, and the corridor observed that order with monkish discipline. The calendar did its part. Oak and ash were cut in summer and stacked to dry under sheds. When winter came, the best logs went to halls where men sat long and to chambers where rulers slept. Corridors asked for little and often received less. A brazier might be placed at a junction during the change of the watch and then carried away. Stewards counted coals as carefully as coin. A passage had no voice at that table except the chatter of teeth, and even that was measured against the scarcity of wood. Movement kept the chill alive. Guards paced, messengers hurried, servants trotted with buckets and towels. Doors opened and closed, each motion tugging at a draught the way a net tugs the water in a slow river. Warmth demands stillness if it hopes to gather. There was no stillness here. Even in the small hours a footstep could be heard, and with it a faint current slid along the ankles. The corridor was a street in a town that never slept and never changed its weather. Architecture offered mercies where it could spare them. Screens were set before the worst slits, so that the wind climbed wood before it found skin, cloth, was hung on rods above doors so that a traveler passed through a fold of fabric. Before meeting the full face of the passage, wax rubbed in seams quieted a whistle, yet cloth drew damp and had to be dried near a hearth, and so it wandered back to chambers that already possessed more warmth than the corridor would ever know. The passage learned to accept borrowed kindness and to give it back again. Food and drink made warmth portable when stone would not permit it to rest. A cup of mulled wine pressed into a guard's hands at the turn of the hour built a small fire. Inside the chest, a bowl of broth did the same. The warmth walked with the man for a little way and left a trail as thin as a thread. The corridor did not keep it. The corridor took taxes from every comfort that passed. If the scent of cloves drifted down a stair, it arrived as memory, not as heat. The nose accepted the charity. The skin did not dot climate pressed like a hand. Some winters were ordinary, others were sermons. Rivers froze and fairs were held on their glass. Wind found the holes in cloth as if the threads themselves had asked for company. Castles change slowly, and weather changes fast. So people adapted. A second cup at bedtime, a worn stone wrapped in linen, an extra guard at the sharpest bend. The building was a scripture, and the household wrote notes in the margin with small practices. That did not alter the text. Above all stood fear of fire. The king above kings in winter management. One spark in a corridor heavy with hangings could chase life through the house as a wolf chases deer. For that reason, comforts remained light and portable. Anything that promised to keep heat also promised to keep flame. Better to suffer the corridor than to wake to embers where a home had been. This fear set the boundary that the other causes understood and served. If a traveler today feels the breath of a corridor and wonders whom to blame, it is fairer to see only the vow kept to its end. Every near cause returns to the first duty, which was to stand when danger came. Stone that will not burn. Openings that admit sight and deny weakness. Plans that favor defense over ease. Rules that keep flame on a short leash. Work that does not rest long enough to grow warm. None of this was meant to wound the body, though it often did. All of it was meant to hold a crown. The corridor gave what the vow required and took a toll. So the narrow ways remained what their builders intended. They joined the places where people lived, and they asked a price for the service. The price was a breath turned white, a pace made careful, a hand kept on the stone. The near causes were simple and many, and together they wrote a climate for those passages in a script that even time can still read with a palm laid flat upon the wall. Cold, duty, stone, breath. Anyone who walks there now learns the lesson the builders learned first. That strength is hospitable to life and inhospitable to comfort. And that the road between rooms is also the record of promises kept. There came a winter when the corridors refused to be ignored. The wind hunted every crack. Lamps guttered though hands shielded them. A queen paused between chapel and chamber and felt the cold reach her wrists. A squire slipped on frost, and the tray he carried rang like a bell. From that season forward, the castle treated the passage as a road that demanded care. The change was not sudden, yet once begun, it did not turn back. Before that winter, Endurance was custom. One pulled the robe close, trusted to a quick step, and accepted the corridor as the price of stone walls. That habit died the night a messenger arrived before dawn with news of a raid and collapsed at the stair. His breath steamed like a horse in snow. He spoke, but his words broke like ice. The steward who had watched the house since youth saw the truth. To keep a fortress was to keep its arteries open. To keep them open, one must warm them enough for life to pass. The first answer was simple. Way stations appeared where bends already slowed the wind. A niche was cut wider. A shelf of stone became a bench. Above it, a bracket took an iron bowl. Coals were carried there at the turning of the watch, not left to blaze, only to glow. A traveler could pause without shame, extend hands, and feel blood grow patient. The smell of iron and ash settled in those corners. It was a small change, yet it gave the corridor a heart that beat at intervals. Doors followed, stout and plain, hung at measured lengths to break the breath of the passage. They did not make rooms. They made rhythm. One door closed, another opened, and the draft lost its road. Felt was tacked where oak met stone, so the seam did not whistle. The latch that once rattled now landed like a muted drum. By day the doors stood pinned for work. By night they worked like sluices, letting labor pass while refusing the river of cold its full run. Light learned its manners. Tall torches gave way to lamps whose flames sat behind horn or oiled skin. The light grew steadier. Wicks were trimmed with a small knife, and the smell of warm oil joined the corridor's catalogue. Shadows no longer danced into panic. They folded into the arches. One could keep the next door in view and trust it to remain. A rule of movement followed, learned like a prayer. No running unless the bell called danger. Carry the lamp low so the flame takes your base. Keep the left hand near the wall. If you meet a lady or a child, turn your warmth toward them for a moment. If a guard stands at a station, share a word. After you have shared a breath over the brazier. This etiquette guarded life. The corridor became a school where the first lesson was courtesy, and the second was survival. Architecture bent in quiet ways. A bench molded to the curve of a pier appeared where once there had been only the blunt meeting of wall and floor. A shallow gutter edged one side so that water could find a path to a cistern. A slit window received an inner screen of wooden slats that baffled the wind. Without blinding the archer, the long whistle fell quiet. The stones seemed to applaud. With silence, servants took new posts. There were coal bearers for the stations and a keeper of wicks who walked the circuit. At the second hour past midnight, a woman whose knees no longer loved the stair kept felt strips and wax. She touched seams and listened. When she found a place that sighed, she dabbed wax across it with the care of a nurse. Closing a small wound, under such hands the corridor changed as surely as a garden under a careful spade. The turning reached the heart of power. Councils ended earlier in deep winter, so the walk back to the chambers could be made. While the circuit was freshly tended, private meetings gathered at the stations rather than at doorways. Two men could stand above the gentle glow and find voices without shiver. Secrets grew less brittle when spoken with warm fingers. The passage, once an enemy to speech, learned to keep counsel in a kinder mood. Sound changed its clothes. The old corridor spoke in clatter and sudden hush. In the sharp note of a latch and the hiss of a dying torch, the new corridor kept another music. Felt quieted latches, lamps murmured. Braziers spoke in a low tongue of coal settling over coal. Boots brushed sand laid with intention. When the bell struck the hour, its note came round the corner like a friend rather than a judge. Smell followed sound. Where there had been the breath of pitch, there was now the comfort of oil, and the faint sweetness of wool warmed at a station. Iron still spoke, but mellowed by ash. The cold itself seemed to own a cleaner scent, as if the wind had agreed to behave. Nothing extravagant had been added. Only order and small measures aligned to meet a large fact. Not every night was merciful. Snow still found the weak door. Water still made a skin on stone where no hand had dried it. A lamp still failed when a boy forgot the wick. Yet failure no longer owned the corridors when a misstep scattered a tray. Help came from the next station and heat from the last one. When a queen paused to gather breath, a lamp waited on a hook and a robe had been warmed at the brazier's lip. The house did not ask less of winter. It asked more of itself. The turning taught a larger lesson. Endurance is not only strength. It is a way of arranging the hours so that weakness is respected and helped. Stone kept its proud place. War kept its stern instruments. Yet between stone and war there ran a smaller craft. A seamstress of comforts, stitching warmth from point to point so that life could cross the cold without tearing. From that winter forward, the corridor ceased to be an absence. It became a presence with work to do. Visitors who walk those passages now can still feel the change. The benches remain. The felt has been replaced, yet the hooks that held it keep their small scars. The slatted screens show their grain where hands rubbed them smooth. Set your palm to the stone and it will feel cool. Hold it there and a calm rises that belongs to order. Listen as you walk and you may hear the hush of a latch and the low talk of a coal. The turning lives because it was made of small things done faithfully. That is the kind of change that stones remember. The corridor's discipline did not stop at the chamber door. It traveled with those who walked there and took root in streets, markets, and cottages. Between winter and war, people learned to pack warmth like a carried good, to lower their voices as one lowers a flame, and to measure haste against the price of a spilled ember. The narrow way taught distance without contempt and closeness, without crowding. From that school servants carried habits to kitchens, courtiers to councils, merchants to stalls, and travelers to roads. Nobles echoed the lesson first. A lord who slowed his step at the bend ordered the same discipline at home. Inner doors were hung to break the wind. Screens stood where drafts struck. Benches were carved into corners so elders could pause with dignity. Felt-lined frames, lamps, with horn panes replaced bragging torches. By night the master walked his halls with the lamp held low. And the household learned that warmth is something carried responsibly, not something flung like light upon a crowd dot in the women's apartments. Kindness became rule. A lady crossing with a lamp turned her warmth toward a child or a maid who met her midway. A queen paused at stations to share a breath with those on duty, teaching rank to bow before need. These gestures left the castle for townhouses and convents. Doors no longer slammed. Voices softened as they passed a sleeping room. Mothers taught daughters to skirt hardship like water and to leave behind a thin gloss of quiet on whatever they touched. Servants felt the echo most closely, for their lives were made of motion. The bearer of coals and the keeper of wicks became figures of trust, their roots as known as the hours. A cook sent broth at the turn of the watch and knew it would arrive because hands had been trained not to spill heat. Apprentices learned a catechism of movement. Do not run, mind the corner, share a breath, keep your light. Pride shifted from speed to steadiness. The humblest task gained a liturgy that made it durable in winter. Trade answered the new needs. Guilds offered thicker cloth for door hangings, better horn for lamps, and wax that did not smoke in cold air. Smiths forged brackets for bowls that could be lifted when hot. Carpenters cut shallow channels along thresholds so melted snow would choose a path. Furriers stitched cuffs for house robes, not only for the hunt. Markets began to smell of oil and felt the scent of people learning to manage weather together and to turn craft into a shield for the body. Justice learned a quieter gait after late councils. Men who had argued hotly walked home through ordered air. Their words shed swagger under the lamps. To rivals, pausing at a brazier, found that anger cannot shout while breath is shared. Disputes softened not because law changed, but because the road between decision and sleep demanded a slower heart. The corridor turned victory into settlement and loss into acceptance. In time, courts praised temperate speech as a civic virtue. Religion kept step with the echo. Chaplains timed prayers to the rhythm of doors and taught choirs to file like a single flame, oil-weighted by the chapel lamp. Shawls lay folded near the threshold for those who arrived shaking. On feast nights, the congregation moved from hall to oratory like a river that knows its banks. The corridor translated fervor into procession, and in procession the weak did not fall behind. Charity found its pace there and carried it into hospitals and almshouses beyond the walls. For guards, the echo changed the measure of strength. A good watchman ceased to clang his spear. He listened. He could tell a tray from a bucket by sound, a tired step from a drunken one, a latch that begged for wax from a latch that lied. That craft went with him when he left service. City watchers learned to keep order by ear as well as by arm. Markets grew safer because men distinguished trouble from need before either raised a shout, and because silence was kept as a tool rather than feared as a void. The echo reached cottages by slower roads, yet it arrived. A mother tacked felt on a door and told children to close it as if closing their own hands. A father set a stool near the draught and placed a clay bowl there for embers. When the wind turned fierce, neighbors crossed the lane with covered lamps and learned to shelter flame with bodies. Without smothering it, villages adopted small stations, a bench by the oven, a hook for a lamp, a shared pot at dusk. Poverty did not vanish, but dignity grew thicker. Architecture absorbed the lesson. Townhouses added inner lobbies between street and stair. Ings folded screens like fans to shape the wind without sealing it. Hospitals hung cloth along wards and trained orderlies to walk, as if sleep were fragile and belonged to all. Even ships, rigged for cold voyages, carried horn lanterns below and taught sailors to keep pace with the lump. Not with impatience, cities learned to love thresholds, the little spaces where violence becomes passage and weather becomes a neighbor. Language kept the echo, phrases passed into speech. Keep the lump, mind the seam, share a breath. To keep the lump meant to carry responsibility without display. To mind the seam meant to tend the place. Where good work fails first. To share a breath meant to stand together until cold bowed. Craftsmen taught these sayings to apprentices. Mothers wove them into lullabies. Priests set them into sermons that praised modest care over sudden zeal, and turned charity from a shout into a steady practice. Not all was gentle. The corridor drew lines between those who rested and those who walked. Fuel went to hearths, errands went to hands. Even so, this division bred a counterweight of respect. Skill became a rank of its own. A steady lamp keeper could choose his work. A careful coal bearer earned more in winter. Nobles honored competence the way they honored courage, for they had felt the result in their bones during the long walk from council to bed, and the long breath before sleep. Beyond persons. The echo touched time. Nights began earlier in deep winter, so the staffed circuit would not grow thin. Shops closed by a bell that matched the castle hours, and towns darkened with intention rather than collapse. People came to think of warmth as something woven from hours and hands, not merely purchased. They measured success by the quiet closing of a door, by a child who reached to bed without fear, by a lamp that arrived with its flame intact and its bearer unhurried. In the end, the echo settled into gestures that outlived the castles. A door closed softly in a cottage far from any tower. A boy steadied a lamp so his grandmother could cross a cold room. A guard in a market leaned his spear to listen to a hinge. These were small proofs that the corridor's discipline had become a commonwealth. It asked little and gave much. Where people carried its lessons, winter found them ready, and readiness looked very much like kindness held at a low, steady flame. We move through our own corridors and imagine we have left stone behind. Lights hum above pale ceilings. Radiators knock on the baseboards like patient hammers. Elevators open with small chimes that try to sound kind. Yet on nights when a building settles and the wind rises, an old breath travels along the floor. And our bodies know it. We draw a coat closer. We soften our voices after midnight. We place a hand on the wall as if it could lend calm. Time grows thin, and the present steps nearer to narrow ways that once asked kings and queens to walk with care. In an apartment block, the corridor is a river of lives. A child sleeps behind one door. A nurse returns from the late shift behind another. A student reads in a third. The hallway asks that these currents pass without collision. We obey by instinct. We lift our bags so they do not brush the paint. We choose quiet shoes. We walk as if our steps belonged to a house larger than our own door. Old courtesies appear in modern dress. We do not carry a brazier. But we tilt a phone downward so its small light will not strike a stranger's face. Hospitals preserve the echo with special clarity. Machines sigh where coals once settled. Monitors blink where lamps once glowed behind. Oiled skin. Attendants still make rounds at the second hour past midnight. And they still learn to move so that breath is conserved. Curtains around beds stand in for the old screens, not to stop arrows, but to baffle the draft of worry that slips from one body to another. A nurse warms a blanket in a cupboard and carries it like a little son when it is laid upon a patient. The shiver eases, and the corridor keeps its oath to serve life. Transit carries its own winters. On a tiled platform, the wind pours along like the invisible river that once moved through tower stairs. A train opens, and the car inhales at one end while exhaling at the other. People enter, and a temporary household forms, held together by proximity and fatigue. We share warmth without touching. We angle our bodies to shelter the tired or the old. When the vehicle lurches, we place a hand on the rail and feel for a breath. The old truth that balance is a social act. In a crowded car, safety is a choir, sung softly and in time. Officers remember the corridor as well. After a long meeting, people leave the conference room with tempers cooled by the hallway. Sharp words loosen in the measured act of walking. The mind adjusts to doors and corners, and the wish to finish replaces the urge to win. The punishment for haste is still embarrassment, if not a bruised elbow. A good manager becomes a patient steward who notices which latch begs for wax, which door closes to hard, which light is too bright for late hours. The etiquette of the passage ripples into the etiquette of work, and the day lands more gently. The present changes the balance in ways the past would envy. Heat answers a dial. Light answers a switch. The old fear of fire has become alarms and codes, yet it still shapes behavior. We do not hang heavy cloth in stairwells. We keep exits clear. We mark routes with glowing signs that behave like modest torches. Safety writes itself into architecture through rules. That are new oaths spoken for the sake of many lives we keep. Then without ceremony, because the corridor still whispers that danger loves speed and smoke, and that careful steps preserve a household better than bravado. At home the passages are smaller and kinder. A child pads through the dark to the bathroom, and a night light waiting there serves as a gentle station. A parent keeps slippers near the bed and a glass of water within reach. These are not luxuries. They continue an old craft of care. When the power fails during a storm, candles appear, and the house remembers how to be old. People gather in one room and speak in quiet voices. Someone warms a blanket in a dryer before the electricity is lost. The door becomes a promise that warmth waits just a few steady steps away. There are corridors under the earth that keep history like a cool hand. Museums lead us through vaults, where the air tastes of lime and time. Old castles open their passages to careful feet. We trail fingers along a wall and think of the thousands who walked there before us. We meet the humility of endurance. The stories we carry about crowns become quieter. We see that rulers, like us, learned to move steadily, to keep the road close, to mind the scene where heat leaves and cold enters. Their splendor depended on patience, and their patience looked very much like simple discipline. The present reflection asks a plain question. If the corridor taught patience, order, and shared warmth, what does it ask now? Perhaps it asks that we keep our own stations, not with braziers, but with kindness that waits at corners. Perhaps it asks that we listen for hinges that need tending. In our institutions, in our families, and in our streets, a society is a house that breathes through many passages. If drafts move too harshly, the weakest suffer first. Tending seams is unglamorous work. It prevents the wind from taking hold. It is the quiet trade that keeps rooms human. Walk a city at night, and another lesson appears. In a quiet concourse, sound is reduced to a plain music. Rubber soles slide. Fabric whispers. A guard coughs. A cleaner moves a cart. These are not notes of triumph. They are the music of care. The world is kept in working order by people who have learned the school of measured steps. We owe them the courtesy the corridor taught. Slow down. Share warmth where you can. Do not waste the air with needless noise. Let silence be a kind of wealth, held not to exclude, but to protect the fragile work of others. There is a private lesson as well. In the rooms where we rest, privacy is easy to purchase and easy to forget. Yet nights still ask for preparation. A book laid ready, a light within reach, a robe on a peg, a thought spared for the person who will rise before you and pass down the hallway with careful feet. To arrange such things is to respect the tender hours when we are most human. The chamber remains a sanctuary, and the path to it still deserves gentleness. A door blesses best when the way to it has been made patient and clear. If there is wisdom beneath all of this, it is that strength and tenderness are not enemies. The corridor proves it. Stone can keep faith with life if we meet it halfway. We keep the lamp by learning to carry warmth rather than demanding it. We mind the seam by finding where the cold enters and placing a hand there until it quiets. We share a breath by standing together long enough for fear to loosen. The narrow ways of old have thinned into modern hallways. Yet the work remains in every step between public and private, between fatigue and sleep, between loneliness and company. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. We set out in the cold of stone and ended by the small light we carry in our hands. The great hall gave us spectacle and exposure. The chamber taught us seclusion and care. The corridors asked for measured steps, patient breath, and the courtesy that keeps warmth alive from door to door. Kings and queens learned these lessons before we did. They trusted thick walls to hold danger back and trusted thin rituals to guide them through the night. Their crowns glittered at the feast, yet their survival depended on quiet habits that any household could learn. What remains after the banners fade is simpler than splendor. A robe kept near at hand, a lamp held low so its brightness does not blind another, a pause at the bend so that the wind spends itself before it reaches the next face. Warmth was never only a matter of fuel. It was a matter of attention, of noticing where the seam lies and laying upon there until the draft grows still. Architecture made the promise. Human discipline kept it. We carry this inheritance in our own buildings without naming it. A corridor. In a hospital where speech softens. A stairwell that we descend with care at 2 in the morning so others may sleep. A manager who ends a meeting in time for the staff to walk through ordered air rather than hurry past one another. These are small versions of an old oath. Strength holds the world together during the day. Tenderness keeps it inhabitable at night. If the castle's taught anything, it is that privacy and mercy are not luxuries. They are tools that allow life to continue when winter presses its face against the glass. The whole will always tempt us with noise and victory. The chamber waits with a steadier lesson. It tells us to prepare a place for rest, to let our power grow quiet, to remember that dignity depends on how we cross the distance between public and private. So the question returns to us. When the wind slips under your door and the house grows still, what station will you keep? Will you be the person who steadies a lamp for another to pass? Will you be the hand that minds the seam? Will you be the voice that learns to fall gentle? In the corridor where someone is trying to sleep, the stones are old, but the work is new each evening. It asks for nothing grand. It asks for attention, patience, and a warmth that you can share. Leave the feast with calm. Close the door softly and let the room remember you were kind. Leave a question for yourself as the light dims. What is the one small habit that would make your night more human? Leave a 1 if you are still awake. And don't forget to subscribe to join me on the next journey.